He rode into a forgotten town just to buy grain. But what he found was something far greater than survival. A broken woman cast out by her own family, a loyal German shepherd who guarded her through every storm, and a test of faith that would change everything. When the winds rose and the town turned against them, only love, courage, and the grace of God stood between life and ruin. People said they were cursed, but when the rain finally returned, they witnessed a miracle no one could explain, one that could only come from heaven itself. This isn't just a story about a man, a woman, and a dog. It's about how faith rebuilds what the world tries to destroy. If you believe in God's quiet miracles, stay till the end, hit subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs hope today. May God bless you, and may the rain always find your heart. Red Willow lay in a bowl of heat and dust, a small Arizona town whose false fronts and leaning porches stared out over a plain the color of baked clay. The noon sky was a bleached enamel with no cloud to soften it. The wind carried grit like ground glass, and the only mercy came from the staggered shadows of water tanks and hitching rails where skinny horses dozed with reins slack and ribs faintly visible. The dry season had outstayed its welcome. The creek was a string of shallow mirrors between stones, and the air smelled of hot iron, old leather, and the distant tang of alkali that stung the tongue. A bell clanged somewhere in the blacksmith's, a telegraph clicked behind a warped window, and the saloon doors flapped with a tired creak, as if the whole town were breathing through chapped lips. Samuel Carter rode in from the north on a buckskin gelding that had more grit than sense, a German shepherd trotting at his stirrup with the loose-hipped confidence of a working partner. Samuel was 36, long in the leg and spare through the waist from years of riding fence and army rations. His face was a hard geometry of cheekbones and jawline burnished by sun, his eyes gray and steady under the brim of a sweat-salted hat. A pale scar, pistol sight, border skirmish, cut a quiet accent across his right eyebrow, and a week's beard darkened his jaw without ever quite softening it. He carried himself with the self-containment of a man who had already miscounted the number of things he could afford to lose and learned to speak only when it mattered. The war years and one winter of failed cattle had shaped him into a careful, courteous man whose patience could stretch thin as rawhide, but rarely snapped. Beside him trotted Rex, 4 years old, a big-boned German shepherd with a saddle-black back and warm sable legs, ears sharp as arrowheads, tail a metronome of watchfulness. Rex wore the dust like a uniform and moved with the measured calm of a dog taught to read men before they read themselves. Brave in the way of loyalty rather than show. A creature that would stand his ground because he had decided the ground belonged to his person. Samuel dismounted at Morrison's general store, a long room with plank floors scarred by boot heels and freight crates, its shelves crowded with bolts of calico, jars of dried beans, kegs of nails, lamp chimneys, matches, and bargains that were only bargains for men who had cash. The ceiling fan pushed heat around, like a lazy preacher moving sin from one pew to the next. Behind the counter, Silas Morrison stood in his neat vest and sleeve garters, a trim, waxed mustache on a face that always looked as if it were calculating someone else's loss against his own gain. Morrison was a man who spoke in a slow, comforting voice when collecting payment, and a faster, louder one when denying credit. His thin hands were quicker than his smile. "Afternoon," Samuel said, tipping 2 fingers to the brim. Rex sat without command, tongue out, eyes bright, but still, the very picture of manners. "3 sacks of feed barley if you have it." Morrison's eyes flicked to the dog, then to Samuel's dusted shirt. "Barley's dear this month." Drought taxes everything: soil, beasts, and men who think they can keep as many horses as last year. Samuel's mouth didn't move much when he smiled. So does talk. Let me worry my own herd. He counted bills with a quiet precision that made Morrison's fingers itch to recount. A few men leaned at the Cracker Barrel, local hands off for the day, their faces red along the cheekbones, their knuckles scarred by rope and boredom. Among them stood Hank Dorsey, a square-shouldered rancher with the kind of confidence that grows wherever money and beer flow without interruption, his lower lip pushed out by a chew the size of a walnut, and his blue eyes forever hunting for a smaller thing to step on. The bell over the door rang again, and the air shifted. Conversation thinned, not out of politeness, but hunger for spectacle. Grace Turner stepped inside with a small breath she tried to hide, a woman of 27 wearing a washed, thin calico dress mended at the hips and cuffs. She was narrow-shouldered and tall enough to look men in the face without craning, her figure made of angles instead of curves by months of poor meals, her skin the pale gold of a person who worked outside without the luxury of shade, and her dark hair was braided and pinned so neatly it denied the fray of her circumstances. What made people look twice was not her prettiness, though she had a fine-drawn mouth and a straight nose, but the way she carried herself with a stubborn, almost regal steadiness, chin level as if balancing a glass she refused to spill. Hardship had sanded her softness, but not her dignity. Morrison's pleasantness cooled a few degrees. "Mrs. Turner," he did not say ma'am. "What can I do for you?" Grace held a small leather purse pressed flat against her palm. The strap had been broken and stitched, an artifact of care and necessity. "Flour," she said, keeping her voice even. £5 if it can be managed. Salt, lard, if you have a small tin. Her voice carried the faint education of a girl who had once been invited to read in the parlor, not the kitchen. Marriage had replaced books with chores and hope with a ledger. Her husband's people, wealthy, prickly Baptists with money and land and pride, had found her failure to quicken the cradle an offense to family and heaven alike. And when the husband ran off after a winter's quarrel, the same people found it tidier to blame the barren wife than the son who had brought her home. Samuel knew the outlines, because Red Willow knew everyone's outlines and loved to trace them in public. Morrison drew the ledger nearer as if it were a Bible. "Your account has items." He showed his teeth in something that wasn't a smile. "And times are tight." Hank Dorsey chuckled behind her. "Tighter for some, I reckon." Grace placed coins on the counter one by one, so carefully they made no ring, only a tired click. Morrison spread them with his fingertip like a man dealing out a thin hand. "Half the flour, perhaps?" "I'll take what it pays for," she answered, and in the brief flare of her nostrils there was both humiliation and a promise not to cry. Behind her, a thin woman in a sun-bleached shawl, Mrs. Pike, who minded other people's sins like hens, whispered, "Poor thing can't give a man a son nor a supper," and the whisper was loud enough to be a sentence. Hank Dorsey leaned his elbow on the barrel and spoke around his chew, eyes bright with meanness that liked to dress itself as country wit. "There's ways to earn coin if a lady is willing to be neighborly." Rex's ears tipped forward. He did not growl, but he stood up with a slow, inevitable motion that suggested a different order of manners. Samuel shifted his stance, not so far as to make a show of it, just enough to shorten the distance to the counter. "Silas," he said, letting Morrison hear his name in a tone that would not fit warmly inside a parlor. "Put flour, salt, and lard on my bill, and throw in a small bag of sugar." Morrison's gaze slid to the cash Samuel had already paid and found his room for argument narrowing. The storekeeper had an instinct for where profit ended and trouble began. "Mr. Carter, you settled for your barley? Then call what you failed to credit me last spring even," Samuel said mildly, and the words had the settled weight of a fact remembered by a man who counted nails when roofs were raised. Morrison remembered, and his eyelids offered a small apology that his mouth did not. He began to wrap the flour in brown paper with practiced flicks. Grace turned toward Samuel, and up close the particulars of her suffering were plain but not pitiable. The hollows under her cheekbones, the faint webbing of worry at the outer corners of her eyes, the small tremor in her left hand where the purse string had worn a groove. She had the look of a person accustomed to hearing a price attached to mercy, and so she searched his face not for kindness, but for the hook buried inside it. "I can't accept charity," she said, and her voice was not proud so much as careful, as if refusing the wrong thing might break something that could not be mended. "You aren't," Samuel answered. "The store made an error in my favor. I'm setting it right." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at Morrison, so that the dignity landed where it belonged. Hank Dorsey snorted like a horse finding a snake. Listen at the night and his mutt. He took a step nearer, boots squealing on gritty plank. Rex matched that step with one of his own, chest forward, head high, eyes never leaving the man's midline. His lips stayed down, but the message traveled anyway, simple and old. "You will keep your distance." Dorsey lifted his hands the smallest inch. "Easy there, soldier." His eyes slid to Samuel's scar. "Heard you left pieces of yourself on the border." Samuel's jaw worked once, the muscle jumping like a small hammer under skin. "We all leave something." He turned back to the counter. "How much, Silas?" Morrison tied string around the parcels and slid them across without flourish. "We'll write it proper." He wet the pencil with his tongue, scribbled, then, reluctantly, struck out a line only he could read. Grace gathered the brown bundles, balancing weight as if she were negotiating with fate. One arm curled around the flour, the other cradled the sugar like something fragile. Up close, Samuel could smell the honest dust of her and the lavender ghost of a bar of soap scraped thin. You could tell a lot about a person by the economy of their scent in a dry country. "Thank you," she said, the words as light as a needle and just as sharp. "I will find a way to repay." "No need," Samuel said, touching the brim in a gesture that cost nothing but felt like it did. He stepped aside so she could walk before him, so no one would say he walked behind her like a claim. Outside, the light was so white it made the town look like a picture faded by sun. Grace lowered her head into it and set off toward the poorer end where fences sagged and doors stuck in their frames. A boy across the street paused with a hoop in his hand. A teamster shaded his eyes. Talk rose and fell behind Samuel in small, mean waves, as if the room were glad to have something to churn again. Morrison leaned forward over his ledger, voice dropped to the pitch of a friend. "You've made a mistake, Carter. Men don't forget who stands where when the wind turns." Samuel lifted the barley sacks, one on his shoulder, one on his hip, the weight good in the way of honest burden. "There are worse mistakes," he said. He walked out into the liquid brightness, Rex moving at heel without needing the word, the dog glancing once toward the street where Grace's figure grew smaller against the glare. Samuel told himself that heat made the air wobble so a person appeared to flicker, here and gone, and that kindness should travel light, because it seldom returned the favor. He tied the feed across the gelding and set his boot to the stirrup, but his eyes had already gone searching down the street, as if searching were a habit learned in bad seasons and good. He had come for barley and the quiet business of surviving. Instead, he had stepped across a line drawn by other men's mouths. Rex lifted his nose, testing the wind. Somewhere a vulture swung slow circles over the far ridge, and the telegraph clicked out a private code no one on the street could read. Samuel swung into the saddle and felt the day tilt under him, the way days sometimes do when they pretend to be ordinary. He touched his heel to the gelding and rode north, the dog pacing easily beside. And if he looked back once to see the dark knot of Grace Turner moving along the blistered boards of Red Willow's poor end, well, that was between him and the sun. By the time he cleared the last house and the town fell away behind mesquite and dust, he knew a thing he wouldn't speak yet, that in a place where water was measured in mouthfuls, mercy would be measured that way too, and men would count it against you. He had marked himself, whether he meant to or not, as the one who stood when others slouched, and the road back to not caring had vanished like a hoofprint in wind. 3 days later, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of dust and creosote from the low desert. Samuel Carter rode out again, the buckskin's hooves drumming against the hardpan, Rex pacing silently alongside. The sun burned lower this time, a deep copper coin sliding toward the jagged horizon. The trail he followed led past dry washes and mesquite tangles until the land flattened into scrub and cracked soil, where a solitary cabin crouched like something left behind by time. Its roof sagged under old tin sheets, and a porch leaned sideways on one remaining post. The boards were gray with age, the nails working loose from years of wind that never stopped talking. Rex stopped first, tail high but uncertain, ears turning. Samuel eased in the reins and watched the smoke rising thinly from a stovepipe no wider than his wrist. He could feel the air change, the quiet that lived around people who had run out of company. When he dismounted, the ground cracked beneath his boots. He slung a small sack of seed corn from the saddle, another of barley, and a wrapped bundle of jerky and salt he had tucked in as an excuse. The wind rasped against the tin, and a curtain shifted behind the small window. The door opened a fraction. Grace Turner stood there, her face pale in the dusk light, one hand wrapped around the handle of a kitchen knife. She had tied her hair up in a kerchief the color of dry roses, but strands had escaped to brush her cheeks. Her dress was the same one he remembered, patched, faded, but scrubbed clean. The knife trembled only slightly, though her jaw was set. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low but steady. "Eli," he corrected out of habit, then caught himself. He was not Eli, and this was no story told around a fire. "Samuel," he said instead, his own voice roughened by the miles. "Brought something might be useful." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't recall asking." "Didn't say you did," he answered. "But a man can't ride past a house trying to starve itself into pride." He set the sack down slowly, careful not to move closer than she'd allow. Rex sat beside him, gaze steady, tail brushing the dirt once, twice. Grace hesitated, then lowered the knife. "The store's been talking," she murmured, not looking at him. "They always do," Samuel said. "I've learned words weigh less than seed. You plant them both, only one comes up worth keeping." Something in the corner of her mouth twitched, a flicker that might have been the ghost of amusement or just weariness. She stepped aside. "If you're set on lecturing, you might as well come in." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dryness. The walls were bare boards, with daylight leaking through the seams. A single chair sat near a rough-hewn table. A kettle hissed quietly on the stove, its black surface scarred from years of heat. There were 2 tin plates, 1 cup, and a loaf of bread so hard it might have served as a hammer. Yet everything was clean, meticulously so, as if order were the only thing Grace could still control. She noticed his eyes on the room and said, "It was my father's hunting cabin. After he passed, my brothers sold the land. This was all they didn't bother to take." Samuel nodded. "It holds better than most shacks I've seen. Because I nail it back every time the wind tries to tear it apart," she said. There was no self-pity in the tone, only fact. Rex sniffed around, nose brushing the floorboards, then returned to sit by the door. Grace's gaze softened a little at the sight of him. "He's different," she said. "Not like the curs men bring to the mines." "He's Rex," Samuel said. 4 years old. Found him half-starved in a canyon outside Bisbee when he was a pup. Learned fast, never forgot a face, never forgave a threat." "Sounds like someone else I know," she said quietly. He smiled at that, a rare thing that changed the shape of his face, softening the scar into something almost kind. "Maybe," he said. They went outside as the light began to thin. Samuel unrolled the seed sack and crouched by the edge of the small patch of dirt near her porch. The soil was cracked like pottery, but under a few inches of dust, it still had weight to it. He pushed his fingers in, showing her. "You dig deep, make a basin around the roots. The rain you get here doesn't come often, so you make it stay when it does." Grace knelt opposite him, her skirt catching dust. "I tried planting once. Everything died." "Everything does out here," he said, "but some of it comes back when you stop expecting it to." They worked quietly for an hour, trading few words. Rex trotted between them, nose pressed to the earth as if judging the work. When Samuel finally leaned back, the first stars had begun to pierce the sky, small, cold lights above a horizon still glowing dull red. He stood and brushed his hands on his jeans. "You'll need to water at dawn and again before dusk. Not more. Let the roots chase it." She nodded, sitting back on her heels. "You sound like a preacher. Spent too long listening to my own mistakes. Gives a man sermon habits." Grace smiled faintly, her first true one. It changed her face, not by beauty, but by life. The sharp lines softened, and for an instant, Samuel saw the woman she must have been before everything turned to hard edges. Inside again, she poured 2 tin cups of water from a jug that looked lighter than it should. "It's not coffee," she said, almost apologetic. "Then it's worth more," he replied, accepting it. They drank in silence. The wind picked up outside, moaning through the seams. One of the shutters banged open and back again. Rex growled low, not in fear but instinct. Samuel rose, crossed the small space, and caught the shutter before it tore loose. "You need a brace," he said. "That's what keeps a wall standing." He found a spare board near the stove, drove it into place with the heel of his hand. When he turned, Grace was watching him with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, more like confusion, as if she couldn't decide whether this man's presence was a mercy or a storm. "You'll have supper?" she asked. "It's only bread and beans." He shook his head. "I've got a long ride. Best leave before the dark thickens." She walked him to the door, holding a candle whose flame bent in the draft. "The town won't thank you for helping me," she said. "I didn't ask it to," Samuel replied, "and I don't recall asking the town for advice." Rex rose, stretching, the tips of his fur shining in the candlelight like brushed metal. Grace reached out without thinking and let her fingers graze his head. He leaned into it once, approving, then followed his master out into the cooling night. The desert stretched before them, wide and endless, the wind now carrying a hint of coming rain that might never arrive. Samuel looked back once. Through the open door, he could see Grace standing with the candle, the light trembling in her hand, her figure framed by the emptiness around her. As he mounted, Rex gave a soft bark, not warning, not farewell, but something between. Samuel touched the brim of his hat toward the cabin. "Good night, ma'am." The hoofbeats faded into the darkness, leaving only the whistle of wind through the tin roof and the faint sound of a woman exhaling the kind of breath one holds too long. Inside, Grace turned down the wick of the lamp. On the small table lay the seed sack, the promise of something to come if the sky would ever remember mercy. Far off, thunder rolled once, too distant to count as hope, but close enough to remember it existed. The wind came first, soft as breath, curling under doors and sighing through mesquite branches before it found its voice. By noon, the air over Red Willow had thickened into a copper haze, the sun a dim coin behind a curtain of grit. The town had been whispering for days, and now the desert itself seemed to join in. In Morrison's store, talk traveled faster than goods. The regular men, Hank Dorsey among them, sat nursing warm beer, their laughter brittle. "Carter's taken to living out there with that barren woman," Hank sneered, tapping the counter with a filthy fingernail. His cheeks were red from whiskey and spite, his hat tilted just enough to make arrogance look like style. Can't blame him, I suppose. Some men can't tell a charity case from a wife. At the back of the room, a newcomer listened. A tall man in his early 40s with a drooping mustache gone gray at the edges. Sheriff Dean Walters, once a cavalry sergeant, had seen more storms than he cared to count. His face was cut with lines that spoke of long patrols and longer nights, his left hand missing 2 fingers from a skirmish years back. Dean had a reputation for fairness, but not warmth. He carried his badge like a burden more than a symbol. "You boys talk too much about things that ain't your business," he said, voice even, low. "If Carter wants to throw his back into helping a neighbor, that's his affair." Hank spat tobacco into the sawdust. "Neighbor? You call that woman decent?" Dean looked up, his gray eyes cool. "I call her breathing, which is more than some men in this room deserve." The store went quiet for a moment, before the wind outside howled against the windows, shaking dust loose from the rafters. Miles away, Samuel Carter didn't hear the gossip. He was patching the west side of Grace's roof, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. The afternoon light glared against the tin, and Rex paced below, uneasy, his ears twitching toward the horizon. Grace stood in the doorway, shielding her eyes. Her hair was loose now, strands of dark brown snapping in the rising wind. She looked smaller against the vast land, the hem of her dress whipping around her ankles. "It's worse than usual," she said, her voice nearly lost in the gust. Samuel straightened, feeling the weight of the sky. The horizon was gone, swallowed by a wall of red moving fast as judgment. "Storm's coming," he muttered. He climbed down, grabbing his jacket and saddle blanket. Inside now. The storm hit before they could brace the shutters. Sand hammered the cabin walls like thrown gravel, wind shrieking through every crack. The roof groaned. Rex barked once, sharp and warning. Then the first board tore free with a scream of nails. Samuel lunged for the beam, trying to wedge it back, but the wind ripped harder, carrying the sound of splintering wood. "Get under the table!" he shouted. Grace hesitated, clutching the stovepipe, to steady herself. "Now, Grace!" Rex barked again, throwing himself toward her, teeth bared, not at her, but at the storm itself, as if it could be driven off. Then came the crack of collapse. The corner beam gave way, the roof caving inward in a rush of dust and darkness. Samuel tackled Grace to the ground, throwing the saddle blanket over them as the cabin came apart around their heads. It was minutes or an hour. Time lost meaning in the roar. When the worst of it passed, Samuel coughed through the grit, pulling the blanket aside. The cabin was half gone, one wall standing like a tombstone against the wind. Grace's hair was full of sand, her face streaked with tears and dust. She tried to speak, but only managed a rasp. Rex pressed close to them, his fur caked gray, eyes bright and wide. Samuel looked at the ruin, then to the open desert beyond. "We can't stay," he said. He slung the saddlebags over his shoulder and lifted Grace without asking. She was lighter than she should have been. The wind whipped at them as they stepped into the night-colored storm. Rex led, low to the ground, guiding them through the chaos like an animal born from it. They walked until the world turned to shapes and sound, the sand hissing against skin, the moan of wind through the canyons. Grace clung to Samuel's neck, her breath hot against his collarbone. When her strength gave out, he carried her, step by step, through the choking dark. Somewhere ahead, Rex barked once, then again, finding something solid. A half-buried ridge of rock offered shelter. Samuel ducked behind it, lowering Grace carefully. "Stay here," he said, though she was already too weak to argue. He found a hollow between the stones, enough to block the wind. Rex circled twice and lay against Grace's side, his body trembling but steady. Samuel built what passed for a fire, scraps of brush sparked by flint, and the tiny flame shivered in the howling dark. Hours crawled past. The sandstorm roared on, relentless, as if the desert meant to erase them. Grace stirred once, eyes glinting in the half-light. "Why?" she began, her voice breaking. "Why are you here, Samuel? Why keep coming back?" He didn't answer at first. His hand found hers, rough against soft. "Because you're still standing," he said finally. "And maybe that's reason enough." Her tears cut clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "They hate me," she whispered. "The town, the women, everyone. They think I'm cursed." "Then they've forgotten what real curses look like," he said, watching the fire gutter. "This land eats pride, faith, and men whole. You've outlasted more than most." The storm began to break near dawn. The wind eased, falling into long sighs. The first light crept over the horizon, turning the air gold and red. Samuel brushed sand from Grace's hair and looked at the wreckage of the world beyond. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. She laughed then, a sound of disbelief and relief tangled together. "Rebuild what? There's nothing left." He looked at her, the lines around his mouth softening. "Then we'll start with nothing. It's the only thing this country gives free." Rex lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound of silence, the pure, ringing stillness after the storm's scream. He gave a low whine and rested his head on Grace's lap. She stroked his neck absently, fingers tracing the warm curve of fur. For a moment, none of them spoke. The desert was hushed, its violence spent, its mercy measured in survival. The sun rose behind them, lighting the scars on the land, the dust on their faces, the small flame that refused to die. When Grace finally leaned against Samuel's shoulder, her voice was barely a breath. "You should have left me." "I tried," he said, almost smiling. "Didn't take." Rex sighed, eyes half closed, the weight of exhaustion and loyalty anchoring him to them both. Somewhere far off, Thunder rolled again, soft this time, almost like a promise. The week after the sandstorm, Red Willow began to breathe again. The dust settled into corners and on windowsills, covering everything in a dull red film as though the whole town had been painted in shame. Word of what had happened to Grace Turner and Samuel Carter spread faster than the storm itself. Some told it with pity, most with scorn. In the saloon, men smirked over whiskey glasses. On the church steps, women whispered beneath their bonnets. It was easier to talk than to look in a mirror. Samuel had spent the days since the storm rebuilding what he could of the cabin. His shoulder still ached from hauling beams, and the skin on his hands had split in thin white lines. Rex limped slightly on his right paw, but refused to rest. Grace moved like a shadow between them, quiet but tireless, hammering nails, sweeping sand from the floor that always seemed to find its way back. She had stopped wearing her hair pinned tight. Instead, it hung loose, dark and tangled, the winds doing more than her own. The morning they decided to ride into town for supplies, the sky was a clear blue, a cruel contrast to what waited ahead. Samuel hitched the gelding, slung the rifle scabbard across the saddle, and tied 2 empty grain sacks behind. Rex trotted close, his coat brushed clean, the faint scar on his muzzle now visible beneath the sunlight. Grace came out carrying her shawl, the same faded one from the day he first saw her in the store. "You don't have to come," Samuel said quietly. "Yes, I do," she replied, adjusting the shawl. "If I'm going to live here, I can't hide every time someone looks my way." He studied her face, still pale but steadier than before. "Then we go together." The ride to Red Willow was silent. They passed the dry creek, now nothing more than a ribbon of cracked earth. When the first rooftops appeared, Grace's hands tightened around the reins. Rex barked once, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. In town, people turned their heads. The blacksmith, Tom Riley, paused mid-swing, his muscular arms glistening with sweat. Tom was a man in his late 30s, tall and broad, his face permanently stained with soot, but his eyes, an earnest gray, betrayed a gentleness not common in Red Willow. He gave Samuel a short nod, the kind men exchange when words could make trouble. Samuel nodded back. They stopped in front of Morrison's store. Grace drew a breath before stepping down. Morrison was behind the counter again, his vest spotless, the smell of tobacco thick around him. His eyes flicked from her to Samuel, then to Rex. "Mr. Carter," he said, tone clipped. "Mrs. Turner." "We need lumber nails, flour, and kerosene," Samuel said, his voice even. "Cash only," Morrison replied, though he had no reason to repeat it. Samuel laid down the coins without argument. As Morrison filled the order, the bell above the door rang. Hank Dorsey came in, followed by 2 others, Pike Stevens and Earl Dalton, both known for drinking more than they earned. Pike was short and wide, with a permanent squint and hands calloused from ranch work. Earl was tall, thin, his blonde hair receding and his lips split from an old fight. Trouble clung to them like the smell of sweat. "Well, if it ain't the saint and his sinner," Hank drawled, his grin cutting through the dusty air. "Didn't expect to see you 2 strolling back here after the storm." Grace stiffened. Samuel turned, his eyes cold. "We're not here for talk." Pike snorted. "Heard you were shacked up out there with your pet and your barren widow." His voice carried the oily pleasure of cruelty. Rex's ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Morrison froze behind the counter, pretending to arrange nails. "Watch your tongue," Samuel said, voice low but sharp. Earl chuckled. Look at him, all riled up. Maybe that dog's the only one she can keep loyal. The laugh that followed was short-lived. Rex lunged forward, snarling, hackles raised, teeth bared like white fire. The room exploded into motion. Hank drew his revolver faster than sense should allow, his face twisting with surprise and rage. "Get that mutt back!" "Rex!" Samuel shouted, reaching for him, but too late. The dog's jaws closed on Hank's arm. The gun went off, the report deafening in the small room. Grace screamed. The bullet grazed Samuel's shoulder, spinning him sideways into a display of lantern oil. The glass shattered, spilling across the floor. Rex clamped harder, shaking his head until Hank's pistol clattered away. Blood smeared across the dog's muzzle, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sheriff Dean Walters burst through the doorway, his coat flaring, shotgun leveled. "Enough!" he barked. The sound of authority in his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. His face was grim, mustache streaked with dust, eyes cold steel. "Drop it, all of you!" Rex released Hank, stepping back to Samuel's side, panting, trembling. Samuel pressed a hand to his shoulder, blood seeping through his sleeve. Grace was beside him in a second, wrapping her shawl tight around the wound. "You're hit," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been worse," Samuel said through his teeth. Hank cradled his bleeding arm, face pale beneath the grime. "He set that dog on me," he shouted. "Looks to me like you brought the gun," Dean said flatly. "And you're lucky Carter didn't shoot first." Earl tried to speak, but the sheriff's gaze silenced him. "You three clear out, now, before I forget my manners." They backed out muttering, fury and fear mixing on their faces. Morrison busied himself sweeping glass, though his hands shook. The few townsfolk who'd gathered at the door stood staring, not at Samuel, but at Rex, who sat obediently now. His muzzle streaked with red, tail low, eyes fixed on his wounded master. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunshot. Grace knelt beside the dog, her hands trembling as she touched his head. Rex licked Samuel's hand once, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried more meaning than words could manage. Dean watched them, his voice softening. "You'd best get that cleaned. Come by the office tomorrow. I'll write a report that says it was self-defense." Samuel nodded. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." Outside, the afternoon sun had turned pale behind a veil of dust. The street was quiet as they made their way to the horse. Grace helped Samuel mount, her fingers stained with his blood. Rex walked close, limping slightly but unbowed. The townsfolk parted to let them pass, silent now, eyes lowered, not from contempt, but something that looked a lot like shame. By the time they left Red Willow behind, the wind had begun to rise again, gentle this time, carrying away the last echoes of the shot that had changed everything. By late September, the sky above Red Willow had changed its color. The old, merciless blue had softened into a deeper shade, heavy with clouds that moved slow and certain. The smell of dust still hung over the valley, but underneath it was something else, something waiting. On the edge of town, the small patch of land that Samuel and Grace called theirs lay quiet. What had once been rubble and scorched beams now stood reborn in timber and sweat. The new house wasn't much, but it was solid. 4 walls of pine, a roof sealed against the wind, and a porch wide enough for sitting. Rex, now fully healed, trotted in circles through the mud, tail high, the faint white scar on his muzzle giving him an air of wisdom beyond his years. Samuel had grown leaner through the months of labor. The wound on his shoulder had knit itself into a long pink line, a reminder of the bullet that could have ended things too soon. His hair had begun to show threads of silver near the temples, and the dust of the desert had worked itself into his beard until it looked permanently sunlit. Grace noticed these things in silence as she worked beside him. She had changed, too. The lines of worry around her mouth had eased, and there was color in her cheeks again, a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. The shawl she once wore to hide behind now hung on a nail by the door, forgotten. The townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid her began to appear again, cautious, curious, their shame wearing the face of civility. The first to come was Mrs. Agnes Cooper, a woman near 70, bent slightly at the spine, with gray hair coiled like rope and hands permanently dusted with flour. She had been Red Willow's midwife and gossip keeper for as long as anyone could remember, her voice sharp as vinegar, but her heart not as hard as she pretended. She arrived one morning with a small sack under her arm. "Thought you might make better use of this than I can," she said, setting it on the porch table. "It's flour, last of my winter stock. Don't go wasting it on biscuits too sweet." Grace smiled, unsure whether to thank her or question her motives. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. That's very kind." The old woman sniffed. Kindness is a word people use when they've forgotten manners. "I'm just returning what's fair." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward Samuel, who stood by the fence mending a post. "Man's got a strong back," she said. "And that dog, Good Eyes, reminds me of the shepherd we had when the mines still paid." Then she turned, shuffling away before the moment could become too human. Later that week, 2 men came to help patch the corral. One was Tom Riley, the blacksmith, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his usual soot replaced by clean sweat. The other was Ethan Moore, a quiet ranch hand in his 20s, freckle-faced and sandy-haired, who had once joined in Hank Dorsey's laughter, but now kept his head low. "Heard you were short on hands," Tom said, hammering a new rail into place. "Figured it was time this town paid off its debt in work." Samuel nodded, accepting their help without ceremony. "Appreciate it," he said simply. By the third afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the valley. The air grew heavy, still, the scent of rain thick as smoke. Rex barked once and then twice, pacing along the porch as if he could sense what was coming. Grace stood in the doorway, watching the horizon. "It's been so long," she whispered. Samuel came up beside her, his hand brushing her arm. "Too long." When the rain came, it was not gentle. It fell in sheets, drumming the roof, soaking the ground until it steamed. The earth drank greedily, and the smell of wet clay filled the air like a hymn. Grace laughed, an unguarded, bright sound that startled her as much as it did him. She stepped barefoot into the downpour, tilting her face upward, arms open wide. Samuel watched her for a long moment before following. Rex bounded between them, splashing through the puddles, barking with something like joy. For hours, they let the rain wash them clean. The garden that had struggled for weeks seemed to rise before their eyes, shoots pushing through the soaked earth. Grace turned toward Samuel, her hair plastered against her cheeks, eyes shining. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" "The land," she said softly. "It's breathing again." That night, the storm eased to a soft drizzle. They sat on the porch under the sound of rain pattering on the roof. The lamp inside threw warm light across the boards. Grace's hands were folded around a tin cup of tea. Samuel sat beside her, one leg stretched out, the other bent, his rifle leaning against the wall behind them. Rex lay at their feet, his head resting on Samuel's boot. eyes half closed, ears twitching every time thunder rolled in the distance. The silence between them was comfortable now. After a long while, Grace spoke. "Do you ever think about leaving? About starting somewhere new?" Samuel considered it. "I used to," he said. "But I think what we build matters more when it's built where we've been broken." She turned that over in her mind, watching the rain slide down the porch steps. "You don't talk much?" she said after a pause. "Words spend easy," he replied. "Work pays slower, but it lasts." She smiled, setting the cup down. "You've done both." He looked at her then, really looked, and the space between them seemed smaller than the night before. "Grace," he said quietly, "you don't owe me thanks." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I'm giving it." She reached out, her hand finding his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of the rain filled the world. When the last drop fell and the stars began to return, they stayed that way, hand in hand, their shadows stretching across the porch floor. Rex sighed in his sleep, tail thumping once against the wood, as if agreeing that peace, for now, was enough. Out in the dark, the land of red willow shimmered beneath the starlight and the rain's afterglow. The fences stood straight, the new roof held firm, and from the soft black earth came the faint, steady promise of green. Sometimes, God's miracles don't come as flashes of light or voices from the heavens. They come quietly, in the shape of a loyal dog that refuses to leave your side, in the strength of two broken souls who choose to rebuild instead of surrender, and in the first drop of rain after a long, merciless drought. Samuel and Grace didn't find gold or fame or glory. What they found was something greater, the grace of endurance, the proof that even when the world turns its back, faith, love, and simple kindness can rebuild what storms destroy. Like the land of red willow, our own lives are sometimes dry, cracked, and silent. We lose people, we lose hope. We question if God still walks beside us. But maybe his voice isn't gone. Maybe it's in the small mercies that surround us. A friend who shows up when no one else does, a stranger's act of compassion, or the courage to keep believing when nothing seems left to believe in. So when your own desert days come, when life feels barren, lonely, and unjust, remember Samuel, Grace, and Rex. Remember that even after the harshest drought, the rain will return, because God never leaves the soil where kindness is planted. May the Lord bless everyone who listens, watches, and believes in quiet miracles. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment, share it with someone who might need hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the strength of the human spirit and the gentle hand of God in everyday life.